Comrades, I speak to you today not with the language of comfort, nor with the illusions carefully woven by the architect of our oppression, but with the unyielding truth that gnaws at the foundations of the society in which we live. You are told that you are free, that you choose your path, that your labor is rewarded by your merit, that your voice shapes the world around you. And yet, I ask you, how free is one who must sell their labor to survive? How sovereign is one whose daily existence is dictated by the whims of capital and the unrelenting logic of profit? The very notion of choice in this society is a lie, a myth propagated to conceal the chains that bind you. Understand this. You are not masters of your fate. You are instruments of necessity. Capitalism presents itself as a system of opportunity, but in reality it is a machine that extracts your vitality, measures your worth in monetary terms, and confines your potential within the narrow corridors of exploitation. The streets we walk, the homes we inhabit, the goods we consume all are structured by the demands of accumulation. Your labor, your sweat, your intellect, these are not expressions of freedom, but commodities in the marketplace. And in this marketplace, your choice is predetermined. Toil, consume, obey, and survive. Look around you. Every aspect of life under capitalism reveals the lie of autonomy. The wages you receive are not the fruits of your genius or effort, but a fraction of the value you create, the remainder extracted by those who own the means of production. The education you endure, the media you absorb, the laws you obey all shape your perception of what is possible, while securing the privileges of the ruling class. Choice is not given to the worker. It is rationed, regulated, and orchestrated to maintain domination. Yet, let us not despair, for the necessity imposed upon you is not eternal. Necessity is the child of conditions, and conditions can be transformed. What capitalism presents as inevitability is merely the crystallized interest of a minority wielding power to mask its exploitation as natural order. History is not the product of fate, it is the product of human labor and human struggle, and it is the collective power of the workers, the peasants, the oppressed, that can shatter the illusions of this world and forge a new reality. The question is no longer whether you recognize the chains that bind you, is whether you are prepared to rise against them. Recognize that the myth of choice is not an abstract concept. It is the ideological scaffold that props up inequality. It seduces you into believing that your suffering is voluntary, that your poverty is the result of your failings, that your exploitation is just. It is nothing of the sort. It is the deliberate design of a system that profits from your toil and thrives on your subjugation. We must see clearly that the emancipation of the working class will not come from the concession of the powerful, nor from their benevolence, nor from the illusions of electoral ritual. It will come from organization, from solidarity, from the recognition that we the many hold the power that the few covet. Unite, break the isolation that capitalism imposes, for it is the first and most effective weapon of your oppressors. In union, in collective struggle, in mutual aid lies the capacity to reclaim not only the fruits of our labor, but our very humanity. Revolution is not a word to frighten the timid. It is the necessary expression of historical law. Just as the forces of production develop, so too must the social relations that govern them be transformed. The worker, alienated from their labor, fragmented by private property, subdued by ideology, must recognize that the world as it is, the world as it appears, is not the world as it must be. The world is ours to remake. Therefore, comrades, I call upon you to cast off the illusions of freedom under necessity. I call upon you to see through the myths that perpetuate your exploitation, and to understand that true choice is only possible when the chains of private property, domination, and inequality are broken. Let the unity of labor become the instrument of liberation. Let the consciousness of the masses transform necessity into opportunity, oppression into collective power, and despair into revolutionary action. Rise, organize, recognize the power that lies in your hands, for the world has been built by your labor and can only be transformed by your collective will. The myth of choice will be dispelled, and in its place, a society rooted in justice, equality, and human dignity shall emerge not as a dream, but as the inevitable product of our struggle, our courage, and our unity. Under capitalism, the idea that individuals possess genuine freedom of choice is not merely overstated. It is systematically constructed as an illusion to conceal the mechanisms of control that govern society. From the moment a worker enters the labor market, their options are circumscribed by structural necessity, the need to earn a wage to survive, the compulsion to secure housing, food, and health care, all of which are dictated not by personal preference but by economic conditions imposed from above. The capitalist system presents itself as a world of opportunities where anyone can rise through effort, talent, or ambition, yet this rhetoric obscures the fact that the so-called choices available to the majority are predetermined by class position and material dependence. Those who own the means of production define the parameters within which laborers operate, ensuring that all decisions, even those that appear voluntary, are ultimately constrained by the imperatives of necessity. Work is portrayed as a sphere of freedom, a place where personal initiative can flourish, but in reality the worker's labor is appropriated and its value siphoned to benefit the owners of capital, rendering the laborer's autonomy an illusion. Even the selection of one's occupation, one's place of residence, or the ability to pursue education is deeply conditioned by socioeconomic status, reflecting systemic inequalities rather than individual volition. The illusion of choice serves a crucial ideological function. It pacifies the working class, persuading them that their subordinate position results from personal shortcomings rather than structural exploitation. People are encouraged to believe that if they only try harder, make better decisions, or acquire more credentials, they can transcend their circumstances, while the conditions that limit their agency remain intact and unchallenged. This manufactured freedom obscures the coercive realities of capitalism, where labor is not a voluntary contribution to society, but a requirement imposed by economic survival. To the worker, the act of selling labor may appear as a choice, but it is a choice made under duress, a necessity dictated by material constraints that are external to the individual. The market creates the illusion that one can refuse employment, yet refusal often leads to destitution, social marginalization, or the inability to meet basic needs. In this sense, the worker's choice is coerced by circumstance, for what is presented as free selection is in fact the compliance demanded by structural necessity. The conditions of life under capitalism are such that all decisions are shaped by the imperatives of production, consumption, and survival. Even leisure, education, and personal development are commodified, regulated by the capacity to pay and mediated through access to capital. The worker's options are constrained by the need to secure income, and those who attempt to escape the system often find themselves punished or excluded. Political and social institutions reinforce this framework by promoting the narrative that inequality results from individual failure rather than systemic dynamics. In this way, capitalism constructs a society where the appearance of freedom masks the underlying compulsion to work, consume, and obey the rules imposed by those who own and control the means of production. Necessity, then, is not merely an external condition, but a governing logic that permeates every aspect of life, from labor to education to housing, shaping decisions and constraining agency. Even the so-called freedoms of the marketplace are restricted. The choice of what to purchase, where to live, or which career to pursue is framed by economic power and material access. Workers navigate a landscape designed to favor the interests of the ruling class, making apparent options contingent upon compliance with systemic demands. Under these conditions, the myth of choice functions as an ideological tool to maintain domination, for it convinces individuals that their actions are autonomous, while in reality they are responding to pressures imposed by economic necessity. True choice, in the sense of unconstrained self-determination, is systematically denied to those who must labor to survive, for every decision is bounded by the realities of material dependence. The worker may deliberate, plan and strategize, but their actions are guided by the structural imperatives of survival, leaving little room for genuine freedom. This dynamic creates a society where agency is conditional, freedom is mediated by economic circumstance, and the promise of choice exists largely as a spectacle designed to legitimize the unequal distribution of wealth and power. Every aspect of daily life, from employment to consumption, from education to political participation, is mediated through the prism of necessity, demonstrating that the autonomy celebrated in bourgeois ideology is a fiction constructed to obscure the realities of exploitation. Under capitalism, labor is not merely a human activity or an expression of creativity. It is transformed into a commodity, bought and sold on the market like any other object. The worker, who produces goods and services through effort, skill and time, does not retain the full value of what they create. Instead, the labor they expend is appropriated by those who own the means of production, who extract from it a surplus that becomes the source of profit, wealth, and power for the ruling class. This process is central to the functioning of capitalism, yet it is obscured by ideology that portrays wages as fair compensation and profit as the reward for entrepreneurial risk or innovation. In reality, the value of labor is determined not by the needs or well-being of the worker, but by the calculation of profit, the difference between what the worker is paid and the value their labor produces. This difference, the surplus value, is the cornerstone of exploitation, for it represents labor performed by the worker for which they receive no equivalent return. The commodification of labor reduces human activity to a transaction, stripping it of its social, creative, and personal significance. The worker's time, energy, and intellect are treated as units of exchange, measured in monetary terms rather than as human contributions to society. Every hour spent on production generates wealth for the owner of capital, yet the worker sees only a fraction of that value in wages sufficient to sustain life, leaving the remainder in the hands of those who do not labor. This dynamic is systemic. It is not an aberration, nor a consequence of individual greed, but the fundamental law of capitalist production. The accumulation of surplus value enables the ruling class to consolidate power, invest in further means of production, and perpetuate their dominance over the laboring majority. The worker becomes a producer of value whose own life and needs are subordinated to the interests of capital. The more labor the worker performs, the greater the profits extracted by the capitalist, create a relationship in which the laborer's productivity benefits someone else, while their own material condition remains constrained. This relationship is sustained through social and ideological mechanisms that normalize wage labor and mask the exploitative core of the system. Education, media, and legal frameworks present labor as voluntary, necessary, and just, portray profit as a reward for enterprise rather than as the product of appropriated human effort. Even when workers receive higher wages or improved conditions, the underlying structure of surplus extraction remains intact, for the increase in remuneration is always measured against the value created and controlled by capital. Commodification transforms not only the material output of labor, but the labor themselves into an object of market logic. The worker's time, skill, and health are reduced to exchangeable quantity, evaluated solely in terms of their capacity to generate profit. The human being, once a social agent capable of creativity and self-expression, is reduced to a means of production, valued according to productivity rather than intrinsic worth. This process also generates alienation. The worker is estranged from the product of their labor, from the act of production, from fellow workers, and ultimately from themselves, for their activity is subordinated to objectives they do not control and for which they receive no equivalent satisfaction. The wealth produced collectively by labor is concentrated in the hands of a few, while the majority remains dependent on wages that never fully reflect the value of their contribution. Capitalism thus institutionalizes inequality, using the commodification of labor and the appropriation of surplus value as its central instruments. Every expansion of productivity, every technological advance, every innovation in efficiency, ultimately serves to increase the surplus extracted from workers, reinforcing the dominance of the ruling class. Labor, which should be a source of fulfillment, sustenance, and social cohesion, becomes a vehicle for accumulation and control. The worker's energy, creativity, and time generate a wealth that circulates not among those who produce it, but among those who own the instruments of production, perpetuating a cycle of exploitation that is structural rather than incidental. To recognize this is to understand the economic basis of class struggle, the reason why wealth is concentrated in the hands of the few while the majority labors to meet basic needs, and why systemic change cannot be achieved through reform alone. The commodification of labor is the mechanism through which capitalism maintains dominance, ensures the extraction of surplus value, and reproduces inequality across generations, embedding exploitation into the very structure of society and determining the distribution of power, resources, and opportunity in ways that consistently favor the ruling class over the worker in every society structure. By economic hierarchy, ideology functions as both the veil and the instrument of domination, shaping consciousness to obscure the material realities of exploitation, and presenting social arrangements as natural, just, or inevitable. Under capitalism, the ruling class wields ideology to convince the oppressed that their suffering, deprivation, and subjugation are the results of personal failure, lack of effort, or natural disparity rather than systemic conditions imposed by the organization of production and the relations of power. Schools, media, religion, and political institutions operate to instill narratives that normalize inequality, glorify obedience, and celebrate individual success stories as evidence of meritocratic justice, while concealing the structural constraints that limit opportunity for the majority. By framing the social order as the product of free choice, natural ability, or divine providence, ideology renders invisible the mechanisms by which wealth and power are accumulated by a small minority. Workers are taught to internalize their position as a moral or personal responsibility, believing that if they endure hardship or fail to achieve success, it is because of deficiencies within themselves rather than exploitation imposed upon them. The narrative of opportunity, which promises upward mobility to those willing to strive, functions less as a pathway to liberation and more as a tool of pacification, persuading the oppressed to tolerate their conditions while competing with one another for scraps within a system rigged to favor the few. Ideology thus transforms coercion into consent, turning systemic oppression into a set of norms and expectations that appear voluntary, reasonable, or necessary. It disguises the extraction of surplus value from labor as fair compensation and conceals the alienation of the worker from the product of their activity as a natural condition of human life. Through this process, the oppressed are conditioned to accept exploitation not as an imposed burden, but as a necessary stage of existence, a prerequisite for personal development or moral virtue. The cultural glorification of wealth, individual achievement, and consumer choice masks the material constraints and structural inequities that shape every decision in the life of the laborer, ensuring that dissatisfaction, frustration, and inequality are interpreted as personal misfortune rather than evidence of systemic injustice. Religion, ideology, and legal frameworks often reinforce this perspective by suggesting that suffering has moral significance, that inequality is divinely sanctioned, or that obedience to authority is virtuous, or of which channels discontent away from the sources of structural power. Workers internalize these narratives, seeing themselves as responsible for their own failures and perceiving their exploitation as an outcome of circumstance rather than a function of the social relations that govern production. Even political discourse, framed as participatory or democratic, often functions to legitimize the existing order, presenting elections, legal rights, and policy debates as meaningful expression of choice, while leaving the fundamental inequalities of capital and labor unchallenged. Ideology operates at multiple levels. It shapes desires, aspirations, and moral judgments, conditioning the oppressed to accept constraints on their autonomy as natural, necessary, or unavoidable. It persuades them to pursue individual solutions to structural problems, to compete against one another for limited rewards, and to perceive solidarity as secondary to personal advancement. Education systems, media narratives, and cultural representations work in concert to produce this concept, ensuring that the structures of exploitation are reproduced across generations without overt coercion. In this sense, ideology is a tool of social control, convincing the oppressed that suffering is voluntary, that compromise is virtuous, and that rebellion is unnecessary or irrational. By presenting social relations as natural or inevitable, ideology discourages critical reflection on the conditions that produce inequality and exploitation. It transforms historical and material contingencies into personal moral failings, masking the economic and political arrangements that concentrate power in the hands of the few. Workers internalize this framing, often policing their own dissatisfaction, attributing systemic injustice to lack of effort, intelligence, or virtue rather than to the structures that dictate the distribution of wealth, labor, and opportunity. The more deeply these narratives are ingrained, the more effectively the ruling class can maintain dominance without resorting to overt violence. For the oppressed themselves act as agents of their own subjugation, defending norms and institutions that work against their interests. Ideology that stabilizes the social order, naturalizes inequality, and obscures the systemic exploitation of labor, convincing those who are oppressed that their suffering is a choice, that their deprivation is deserved, and that compliance is both rational and inevitable, reinforcing domination, while preventing the emergence of collective consciousness capable of challenging the prevailing relations of power. True liberation cannot be achieved through individual effort alone, nor through the benevolence of those who benefit from exploitation. It emerges only when the working class recognizes its shared interests and acts collectively to confront the structures that perpetuate inequality and oppression. Under capitalism, workers are divided by occupation, skill level, ethnicity, gender, and geographic location. Yet these divisions are artificial constructs designed to fragment resistance and obscure common exploitation. The ruling class relies on this fragmentation to maintain control, encouraging competition among laborers, pitting one group against another, and cultivating false narratives of merit and individual success. To break the chains of domination, workers must first see through these divisions, understanding that the interests of the many are fundamentally opposed to the interests of the few who control the means of production. Unity is not a passive sentiment, but an active, organized force, requiring the recognition that collective action amplifies the power of those who labor and transforms the potential for change from abstract hope into material reality. When workers act in concert, they wield the capacity to challenge capital, negotiate fair conditions, and demand the redistribution of resources that have been appropriated unjustly. Solidarity is the foundation of this power, for no individual can resist systemic exploitation alone, but organized labor, mutual aid networks, and coordinated action can confront the mechanisms that sustain oppression. History demonstrates that significant advances in workers' rights, social protection, and political influence have emerged not from the goodwill of the ruling class, but from the persistent struggle of organized labor and mass movements demanding justice. Strikes, protests, unions, and councils are the instruments through which collective struggle manifests, allowing the working class to assert leverage over capital, and to demonstrate that the accumulation of wealth is contingent upon labor that can withhold its cooperation. Beyond economic confrontation, collective struggle fosters consciousness, revealing the structural nature of exploitation and dispelling the myths that capitalism imposes to pacify the masses. Through dialogue, education, and shared experience, workers come to recognize that their suffering is not the result of personal failure, but of systemic design, and that their collective strength is the key to transforming society. Organization is essential, for uncoordinated resistance is easily suppressed, while deliberate, strategic, and sustained efforts can create pressure on both economic and political institutions, forcing concessions and laying the groundwork for broader structural change. Political action, grounded in workers' unity, ensures that their voices shape laws, policies, and societal norms, challenging the dominance of capital and instituting mechanisms that serve collective needs rather than individual profit. Organized resistance also cultivates mutual support, creating networks of solidarity that protect workers from reprisals and empower them to persist in struggle, reinforcing the understanding that liberation is inseparable from community and cooperation. This approach to emancipation recognizes that freedom is not merely the absence of immediate oppression, but the ability to shape social, economic, and political conditions in accordance with human needs and collective well-being. The unity of the working class transforms labor from a tool of exploitation into a force for social reconstruction, enabling the reclamation of both material resources and human dignity. True liberation requires vision as well as action, demanding that workers not only resist oppression in the present, but also imagine and implement systems that replace domination with equity, hierarchy with cooperation, and alienation with shared purpose. Collective struggle challenges the concentration of wealth, dismantles structures of private ownership that perpetuate inequality, and asserts the principle that the products of labor belong to those who produce them. It teaches that progress is not granted but seized, that rights are not bestowed but demanded, and that social transformation is inseparable from the organization and mobilization of those whose labor sustains society. Workers' unity is a political and moral imperative, for only when the exploited recognize their common interests, coordinate their actions, and commit to sustained resistance can the power of capital be countered and the condition of life reshaped to reflect justice, equality, and human dignity. Solidarity nurtures consciousness, discipline, and resilience, creating a force capable of confronting entrenched power structures and envisioning alternatives grounded in collective welfare rather than private gain. By acting together, the working class transforms necessity into leverage, oppression into opportunity, and fragmentation into strength, ensuring that the struggle for emancipation is not a series of isolated acts but a coherent, strategic campaign to overturn the foundations of exploitation and to establish a society in which freedom, equality, and shared prosperity are not ideals but lived realities rooted in the power of organized, United labor, real freedom and equality cannot be achieved within the existing structures of capitalist society, for these structures are inherently designed to preserve the dominance of a minority and the subjugation of the majority. The institutions, laws, and social norms that govern daily life under capitalism are not neutral frameworks for cooperation or justice. They are mechanisms of control that reproduce inequality and ensure that wealth and power remain concentrated in the hands of those who own the means of production. Attempts to achieve equality within these confines through reform, regulation, or appeal to morality are necessarily limited, for the system itself depends upon hierarchy, exploitation, and the extraction of surplus value from labor. Therefore, the transformation of social relations is not a matter of preference but a historical necessity. Freedom cannot exist in a society where the vast majority are compelled to sell their labor to survive, where the fruits of labor are appropriated by a privileged few, and where individuals are alienated from the products of their own activity. Real freedom requires that human beings have control over the condition of their existence, that they participate meaningfully in the decisions that shape their work, communities, and lives, and that social organization is oriented toward human needs rather than profit. This is not merely a theoretical aspiration, but a practical imperative grounded in the material realities of exploitation. Social relations under capitalism are structured by private property, wage labor, and hierarchical authority, which create a division between those who control production and those who perform it. These relations generate inequality, alienation, and dependence, restricting individual autonomy and collective potential. To achieve true equality, it is necessary to reorganize society so that the relations no longer dictate access to resources, opportunity, or social power. Ownership and control of the means of production must be socialized, transforming them from instruments of domination into instruments for collective welfare. Only by restructuring the fundamental relationships through which goods, services, and labor are organized can human beings achieve both material security and genuine agency. The transformation required is both economic and social, encompassing not only property relations but also patterns of hierarchy, authority, and cultural domination. Ideologies that legitimize inequality, obedience, and competition must be challenged and replaced with principles that affirm collective responsibility, solidarity, and the equitable distribution of resources. Education, labor, and governance must be reoriented toward participation, cooperation, and the development of human potential, rather than toward the perpetuation of scarcity, rivalry, and dependence on the ruling class. Revolution is necessary because the structures of capitalism cannot be reformed to serve these ends without undermining the very logic upon which they rest. Structural change, not incremental adjustment, is required to dismantle the power of capital, abolish exploitation, and create conditions in which freedom and equality are not abstract ideals but lived realities. Historical examples demonstrate that progress in human emancipation is always achieved through collective struggle, direct action, and the mobilization of those whose labor sustains society. The transformation of social relations requires organized action, consciousness raising, and the establishment of institutions that reflect the shared interests of the many rather than the private interests of the few. This process is both political and moral, reshaping not only economic arrangements but also social norms, values, and practices, fostering a culture of cooperation, mutual aid, and respect for human dignity. Real freedom cannot coexist with inequality, for as long as some individuals dominate, while others are subordinated, autonomy is constrained and opportunity is conditional. Equality, in its fullest sense, requires the elimination of structural barriers that privilege the few at the expense of the many, ensuring that all individuals have access to the material, social, and cultural conditions necessary for self-realization. The transformation of social relations is thus inseparable from the struggle for emancipation, linking the reorganization of production, governance, and social life with the liberation of human potential. Revolution does not merely change who holds power, it reconfigures the foundations upon which society is built, replacing relations of domination with relations of cooperation, exploitation with shared stewardship, and hierarchy with participatory governance. Through this process, the alienation of labor is overcome, surplus value is returned to those who create it, and the social order becomes oriented toward the collective good rather than private enrichment. The creation of a society grounded in freedom and equality demands sustained effort, strategic organization, and the recognition that emancipation is a collective project. By transforming the fundamental relations that govern human life, revolution opens the possibility for genuine autonomy, equitable access to resources, and the fulfillment of human potential for all members of society, ensuring that liberty and justice are not privileges conferred by the few, but rights realized through the power and cooperation of the many comrades. We have laid bare the illusions that shroud our existence under capitalism, the myth of choice, the commodification of our labor, the extraction of surplus value for the benefit of the ruling few, and the ideological chains that convince us our suffering is deserved. We have seen that these conditions are not natural or inevitable, but the result of a system built to concentrate power and wealth while fragmenting and subjugating those who produce the real value of society. True liberation, we understand, cannot come from reform or individual effort alone. It requires the unity of the working class, organized struggle, and the deliberate transformation of social relations. It is through solidarity, collective action, and revolutionary consciousness that we reclaim control over our labor, our lives, and our destiny. The path to freedom and equality demands that we confront the structures of exploitation, dismantle the hierarchy of capital, and create a society where human needs, not profit, shape the conditions of life. In rising together, in organizing, and in resisting, we assert the power that has always been ours, proving that the world we inherit is not fixed, but can be remade through our collective will. The time for recognition, for unity, and for decisive action is now. For only through struggle can the promise of emancipation become a reality.